When we first moved into Oak Ridge Estates, it felt like every dream my parents had worked toward had finally materialized. The neighborhood sat nestled against rolling hills, with streets lined by oak trees that had stood for generations. Our two-story colonial had a wide front porch, 4 bedrooms, and enough yard space for my younger brother Tommy to practice basketball. It was not just any house. It was the culmination of my father's 30 years of military service. His retirement fund, transformed into the home he had promised my mother since the day they married. My father, James Wilson, was not a man who showed emotion easily. Years of military discipline had hardened his exterior, but I could see the pride in his eyes as he carried the last box through our front door. He stood on the porch that first evening, surveying the property with quiet satisfaction. "This is it, Marie," he said to my mother. "No more moving, no more temporary housing. This is where we plant our roots." He had served his country faithfully, and now, at 58, he deserved this peace. The first week was filled with unpacking and meeting neighbors. Most were welcoming. The Thompsons across the street brought over a homemade apple pie. The Garcias next door helped my father set up our lawn mower. Even Mr. Peterson, the retired schoolteacher at the corner, stopped by with a bottle of wine and neighborhood advice. It felt like community. It felt like home. Then we met Corinne Monroe. She did not bring welcome baskets or warm smiles. She brought a clipboard and a forced grimace that barely qualified as politeness. "I am the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, not bothering to step inside when my mother invited her. Her eyes scanned our porch, our yard, our windows, making mental notes of everything that might eventually displease her. "You will receive your copy of the HOA regulations tomorrow. Please review them carefully." My father, ever respectful, thanked her for the information. "We are looking forward to being good neighbors," he said, extending his hand. Corinne shook it briefly, her fingers barely touching his. "Everyone says that at first," she replied, her voice clipped and cold. As she walked away, I noticed how the other neighbors watched her from their windows, their expressions a mixture of caution and concern. The HOA handbook arrived the next day. 300 pages of rules, bylaws, and regulations. My mother flipped through it, raising her eyebrows at some of the more particular stipulations, but my father simply placed it on the shelf. "Standard procedure," he said with a shrug. "Every community has its guidelines." Little did we know that this innocuous binder would become the weapon used against us in the coming months. The trouble began with the porch. My father had always dreamed of a proper front porch where he could sit in the evenings, watching the neighborhood while drinking his coffee. The previous owners had neglected it, leaving the paint chipped and weathered. So one weekend, he purchased supplies and repainted it a warm, inviting blue, a color that reminded him of the ocean near his childhood home. 3 days later, the first notice appeared, pinned to our door in an official-looking envelope. "Violation of HOA Code 723, unauthorized exterior color alteration. Fine, $150. Remedy, repaint using only approved color palette in Appendix C." My father read it aloud, his forehead creasing with confusion. He had not realized that even such a small change required approval. The next day, he visited the HOA office to explain and apologize. But Corinne was not interested in understanding. "Rules are rules, Mr. Wilson. If we make an exception for you, we would have to make exceptions for everyone." That first violation was just the beginning. Suddenly, our lawn was half an inch too tall. Our mailbox was not in compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards. The American flag my father proudly displayed was improperly positioned according to HOA guidelines. Each infraction came with a fine. Each fine came with a deadline. And each deadline came with a threat. It was subtle at first, this campaign against our home, But as I watched my father's shoulders grow more tense with each passing week, I began to understand. This was not about rules. This was about power, and Corinne Monroe was determined to establish hers. The war against our family escalated as summer turned to fall. Envelopes appeared weekly, sometimes twice weekly, each one detailing new violations that seemed increasingly absurd. My brother Tommy had installed a basketball hoop against the garage, the same model at least 4 other homes in the neighborhood displayed. Yet ours alone was deemed structurally invasive and visually disruptive to the architectural harmony of the street. The fine was $300. My mother loved garden gnomes, small, cheerful figurines that she placed among her flower beds. She had collected them for years, each one holding a special memory. Corinne's notice declared them tasteless lawn ornaments prohibited under Section 12 of the HOA Aesthetic Guidelines. When my mother tearfully packed them away, something inside me broke. These were not violations. They were targeted attacks. My father, patient and methodical as always, decided to work within the system. He filed appeals for each violation, citing inconsistencies in enforcement. Houses on the next block had basketball hoops identical to ours. The Samuels family had a collection of flamingos that far outnumbered my mother's gnomes. The Richardsons' house was painted a deep burgundy not found on any approved palette. The appeals process required appearing before the HOA board, a panel of 5 homeowners with Corinne at the helm. My father prepared carefully, documenting each inconsistency with photographs and specific bylaw references. He approached it like a military briefing, precise and factual. But when he arrived at the community center for his hearing, he found only Corinne and her closest ally on the board, a thin man named Richard who never seemed to speak unless echoing Corinne's sentiments. The other board members were unable to attend, Corinne explained with thinly veiled satisfaction, but we still have quorum to hear your appeal. For 30 minutes, my father presented his case. For 30 seconds, Corinne and Richard deliberated. Appeal denied. Every single one. As we walked home that evening, our neighbor Mrs. Garcia waited by her mailbox. She glanced around nervously before approaching us. "I should have warned you earlier," she whispered. "Corinne does this. She picks a family every year or so and makes their lives miserable until they leave. Last year it was the Kims, before that the Johnsons. They both sold at a loss just to escape." My father thanked her for the information, his expression unreadable, but I knew him well enough to see the subtle shift in his posture, the straightening of his spine, the slight clench in his jaw, signs that most would miss but that I recognized from my childhood. My father was not just angry, he was resolute. Strange things began to happen. Our mail arrived days late, sometimes not at all. Important letters from the VA regarding my father's benefits mysteriously disappeared. When he complained to the local post office, they found nothing wrong with their delivery process. But the postal worker, speaking off the record, mentioned that Corinne's husband worked in the regional sorting facility. The HOA violations continued, but now they escalated to formal warnings about bringing down property values. Our home, meticulously maintained by my father who spent hours each weekend on upkeep, was suddenly declared a neighborhood problem. Anonymous complaints cited our general disregard for community standards and hostile attitude toward reasonable regulations. The breaking point came at the quarterly town meeting. My mother, hopping to ease tensions, had baked 3 dozen cookies to share. As she placed them on the community center table, Corinne loudly announced to the room, "While we appreciate the gesture, Mrs. Wilson, perhaps your time would be better spent addressing the numerous violations at your property rather than trying to butter up the community with sweets." The room fell silent. My mother stood frozen, her face flushing deep red. I watched her hands tremble as she set down the plate and quietly took her seat, eyes fixed on the floor. My father, always in control, always measured, reached for her hand but said nothing. His silence terrified me more than any outburst could have, because in that moment I saw something change in his eyes. The patient, rule-following veteran was receding, replaced by something colder and more calculating. As we drove home that night, no one spoke. The tension in the car was palpable. When my mother finally broke the silence with a quiet sob, my father simply said, "They have no idea who they are dealing with." His voice was calm, but his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. The notice arrived exactly 1 week after the town meeting incident. Official HOA letterhead. Bold red text across the top. Notice of suspension of community privileges. My father read it aloud at the dinner table, his voice betraying no emotion as he recited the clinical language that effectively exiled us from our own neighborhood. Due to repeated violations and failure to comply with HOA regulations, the Wilson family's access to all community amenities is hereby suspended indefinitely. This includes but is not limited to the community pool, tennis courts, playground facilities, and participation in neighborhood events. Additionally, the Wilson family is suspended from voting on HOA matters until all violations are remedied and outstanding fines are paid in full. Tommy, 14 and already struggling to fit in at his new school, threw down his fork. "So I cannot use the pool where all my friends hang out. That is literally the only place I have met anyone in this stupid neighborhood." He stormed from the table, slamming his bedroom door hard enough to rattle the china cabinet. My mother reached across the table for my father's hand. "James, maybe we should consider selling, starting fresh somewhere without an HOA." Her voice was soft, defeated. The spark that had always defined her seemed dimmed. My father folded the notice carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "No," he said finally, "we are not running. This is our home. We earned it." Something in his tone ended the discussion, but the battle was far from over. The next day, a printed flyer appeared in every mailbox in Oak Ridge Estates. Neighborhood alert. The HOA board wishes to inform residents of ongoing hostility from the occupants of 1847 Oak Creek Drive. Please report any concerning behavior to the board immediately. The safety and harmony of our community remain our highest priority. They had branded us as threats, troublemakers, outsiders. Neighbors who had once waved now crossed the street to avoid us. Invitations stopped coming. Tommy's friends made excuses about why they could not come over. We became invisible, then visible in all the wrong ways. 3 days after the flyers circulated, I returned from school to find my father in the driveway, staring at our family car. Someone had keyed a message into the driver's side door. 2 words, deep enough to reach the metal beneath the paint. "Get out." My father took photographs from multiple angles. Then he called the local police. Officer Reynolds arrived 30 minutes later, surveyed the damage, and shook his head. "I will file a report, Mr. Wilson, but between us, there is not much we can do. No witnesses, no cameras in this area. And technically, the HOA disputes are civil matters, not criminal ones unless there is direct evidence of targeted harassment." "Someone vandalized my property," my father replied, his voice tight. "Threatened my family." Officer Reynolds shrugged apologetically. "I understand your frustration, sir, but unless you have proof of who did this, my hands are tied. These HOA situations, they get messy. The department tries to stay out of them when possible." That night, I found my mother crying in the kitchen after she thought everyone had gone to bed. My father sat beside her, not speaking, just holding her hand across the table. I had never seen him look so helpless. This man who had commanded troops, who had weathered war zones, seemed defeated by a suburban power struggle. The next morning, everything changed. My father did not mention the car or the notice or the flyers. He made breakfast as usual, wished us a good day, and retreated to his home office. But something had shifted. The helplessness was gone. In its place was something I could not quite identify, a calm determination that was almost more unsettling than his anger had been. Karen escalated her campaign. A certified letter arrived, threatening legal action if we remained willfully non-compliant with HOA standards. It cited bylaws that could lead to liens against our property, even forced sale in extreme cases. It was a nuclear option, designed to terrify us into submission or departure. My mother placed the letter on my father's desk without comment. He read it once, nodded as if confirming something to himself, and filed it away. "Thank you, Charlotte," he said to my mother, "nothing more." That weekend, when the neighborhood held its annual summer festival, we watched from our living room window as families gathered at the park across the street. Children played on swings that Tommy was now banned from using. Adults chatted over food that we had not been invited to share. It should have been the final blow to our family's spirit. Instead, my father stood watching with an almost curious detachment. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "they have no idea what is coming." It was the first time in weeks I had heard anything resembling hope in his voice, but it was not exactly hope that I heard. It was certainty. The changes in my father were subtle at first. He began waking earlier, often before dawn. His morning routine, once predictable down to the minute, now included long walks around the neighborhood, a notebook tucked discreetly in his pocket. He purchased a new filing cabinet, installed it in his home office, and locked it with a key he kept separate from his regular key ring. Then came the phone calls, always behind closed doors, always in the measured, professional tone he had used during his military days. I caught fragments when passing his office. "Yes, that would be Section 42.3 of the county code." Or, "The question is not whether they filed properly, but whether they had authority to file at all." One evening, I answered the house phone to hear an unfamiliar voice ask for James Wilson, former Deputy Director of County Operations. I had known my father worked for the county after retiring from the military, but this title was news to me. When I handed him the phone, he took it to his office immediately, closing the door with unusual firmness. My mother noticed too. At dinner one night, as my father excused himself early to make another call, she watched him leave with worried eyes. "Your father is up to something," she whispered once he was out of earshot. "I have not seen him like this since his days working for the County Planning Commission." "What exactly did Dad do for the county?" I asked, realizing how little I knew about this chapter of his life. My mother hesitated. He was brought in after his military retirement to help restructure some of the more dysfunctional departments. Zoning, planning, records management. He has connections, knows things about how this county operates that most people never think about. She twisted her napkin nervously. He fixed problems. Sometimes that meant making enemies. Late that week, I came home early from school with a migraine to find unfamiliar voices in my father's office. Through the crack in the door, I glimpsed a gray-haired man in an expensive suit examining documents spread across my father's desk. "This is definitely irregular, James," the man was saying. "These jurisdictional boundaries were supposed to be updated back in 2008. "But they were not," my father replied. "And every action taken based on the outdated boundaries could be considered procedurally invalid. This is going to cause one hell of a headache for the commission." My father's voice was calm. "That is not my primary concern, Robert." That night I found my mother standing outside my father's office door, her face tight with concern. Inside, my father was speaking firmly on the phone. "I am not looking to disrupt the entire system, Margaret. Just one small corner of it that has been abusing its authority." A pause. "Yes, I understand the implications. Better than most, I would think." When he emerged later, my mother confronted him in the kitchen. "James, whatever you are planning, you need to stop. We can sell the house, start over somewhere else. This vendetta is not worth it." My father looked at her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the determined set of his jaw. "This stopped being about the house the moment they humiliated you in front of the entire neighborhood, Charlotte. This is about right and wrong now." "But what exactly are you doing? These people you're calling, these files?" She gestured toward his office with growing agitation. "I am simply ensuring that everyone plays by the actual rules, not just the ones they invented to torment us." His voice softened. "Trust me, Charlotte, I know what I am doing." Later that night, unable to contain my curiosity and concern any longer, I knocked on his office door. He was surrounded by maps, county records, and legal documents that looked decades old. Some were marked with yellow highlighter, others with red flags. I had never seen my father look so focused, so alive with purpose. "Dad," I said hesitantly, "what is all this?" He looked up, seeming to debate how much to share before gesturing to the chair across from him. "After my military career, I spent 8 years working for this county. My job was to identify regulatory problems and fix them. Zoning issues, jurisdictional disputes, compliance gaps, the invisible infrastructure that makes communities function or dysfunction." He tapped one of the maps. "I know this county's legal framework better than anyone, including exactly where the weak points are." "And Oak Ridge Estates has a weak point." A smile crossed his face, the first genuine one I had seen in months. "Corinne Monroe and her board have been operating on borrowed authority for years. They just do not know it yet." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "They forgot who I am, who I was. That was their first mistake." For the first time since the HOA war began, I felt something other than dread about our situation. My father was not beaten. He was plotting. And from the methodical way he organized his files, the precision with which he highlighted certain passages in the county code, I realized Corinne Monroe had indeed chosen the wrong family to target. She had not bullied a simple military retiree. She had awakened a man who understood systems, who had spent his career identifying and exploiting regulatory vulnerabilities. And now, all of that expertise was focused on a single target: the Oak Ridge Estates HOA and the woman who ruled it with arbitrary cruelty. "Is this legal?" I asked quietly. "What you are planning?" My father closed one of the folders and looked me directly in the eyes. "Everything I am doing is completely within the bounds of county law. In fact, I am simply ensuring that laws that should have been enforced years ago finally are." His expression grew serious. "Sometimes justice requires knowing exactly where to apply the pressure. That is what I learned in the military, and that is what I perfected working for this county." As I left his office that night, I felt both reassured and slightly unnerved. My father was fighting back, yes, but he was doing it in a way that Corinne and her HOA board would never see coming. This was not a neighborhood spat anymore. This was strategic warfare conducted through paperwork, county codes, and long-forgotten regulations. And my father was a general preparing for the final battle. The first public move in my father's campaign came without warning. A formal complaint filed with the county zoning board, available as public record to anyone who cared to look. The document, over 30 pages long, meticulously outlined violations committed not by us, but by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA itself. illegal signage placed without proper permits, misappropriation of collected fines without transparent accounting, board meetings held without proper notice to all residents, architectural review decisions made without the required quorum of committee members. Each violation was documented with dates, photographs, and relevant county code citations. But this was just the opening salvo. My father had spent weeks quietly meeting with other residents who had suffered under Karen's regime, but had been too intimidated to speak up. The Garcias, whose request to install solar panels had been repeatedly denied despite state laws protecting renewable energy installations. The elderly Mr. Peterson, who had been fined for having a medical ramp installed without proper aesthetic consideration. The Thompsons, whose children's treehouse had been ordered demolished despite being completely on their property and out of public view. One by one, they added their complaints to the county record. What had been one man's grievance transformed into a community uprising, carefully orchestrated from my father's home office. When the county assigned an investigator to review the complaints, Karen attempted to dismiss them as the vengeful actions of problem residents. But the investigator, a straight-backed woman named Darlene Evans, was unmoved by Karen's practiced charm. Ms. Monroe, these allegations involve potential violations of county ordinances, not just HOA rules, Ms. Evans explained during her initial visit to the HOA office. I am required to conduct a full audit of your records going back 5 years. Karen's response was immediate and defensive. That is unnecessary and intrusive. The HOA has operated without county interference for 15 years. That may be part of the problem, Ms. Evans replied, her tone making it clear this was not a negotiation. The investigation proceeded despite Karen's objections. Financial records were subpoenaed. Meeting minutes were reviewed. Board election procedures were scrutinized. For each question Ms. Evans asked, Karen's answers grew more evasive, more strained. As pressure mounted, cracks began to appear in Karen's carefully constructed power structure. Board member Richard Miller, once her most reliable ally, began distancing himself publicly. I simply followed established procedures, he claimed when questioned about architectural review decisions that had targeted specific homeowners. All final determinations were made by President Monroe. When Karen called an emergency board meeting to discuss strategy, someone, we never discovered who, leaked the time and location to every homeowner in the community. What was meant to be a private strategy session became a public reckoning as residents packed the community center, demanding answers about discrepancies found in the HOA financial reports. Karen attempted to adjourn the meeting, citing improper notification procedures, only to have Ms. Evans stand from the back of the room. Actually, Ms. Monroe, under County Code 37.2, any meeting of a registered homeowners association must remain open to all members once commenced, regardless of notification procedures. It was the first time I had seen Karen truly flustered, her composure cracking as she realized she was no longer the ultimate authority on rules and procedures. Someone else knew the regulations better than she did, and that someone had the enforcement power of the county behind them. But the true masterstroke came 3 days later. My father, having combed through decades of county records, presented the zoning board with evidence that would change everything. Oak Ridge Estates had been developed in phases, with our street, Oak Creek Drive, added in the third expansion. But due to a clerical error never corrected, our street had never been properly incorporated into the HOA's legal jurisdiction. According to the original filing, my father explained to the stunned zoning board, displaying yellow documents bearing official county seals, Phase 3 was conditionally approved pending submission of amended covenants accounting for the watershed protection zone at the north end of the development. He placed another document alongside the first. That amended filing was never completed. Therefore, all properties on Oak Creek Drive, while marketed as part of Oak Ridge Estates, legally fall outside HOA jurisdiction. Karen, present for the hearing, rose to object. That is preposterous. Those homes have been part of our community for years. The residents signed membership agreements. Agreements, my father countered calmly, that have no legal standing if the HOA itself lacked jurisdiction to require them. This is not an administrative technicality, Ms. Monroe. This is a fundamental question of legal authority. The board called a recess to review the evidence. Karen paced the hallway, making frantic phone calls. When the session resumed, the board chair cleared his throat uncomfortably. Based on the documentation presented, it appears that an administrative oversight occurred during the Phase 3 expansion of Oak Ridge Estates, he announced. Until proper filings are completed, which would require new consent from current homeowners, the HOA lacks enforceable jurisdiction over properties located on Oak Creek Drive. In that moment, watching from the back of the room, I saw Karen Monroe truly understand what had happened. She had spent months targeting our family, using rules as weapons. Now those same rules had been turned against her with devastating precision. And the architect of her downfall was the quiet veteran she had dismissed as an easy target. As we left the hearing, my father placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Always remember," he said quietly, "true power is not about control, it is about knowledge." The disintegration of Karen Monroe's authority happened with stunning swiftness. Within a week of the zoning board ruling, emergency HOA board meetings were called to address the growing crisis. Homeowners, emboldened by my father's success, began questioning policies and decisions that had gone unchallenged for years. Board member Richard Miller was the first to publicly break ranks. In light of recent revelations about procedural irregularities, he announced at a hastily assembled community meeting, "I move that Karen Monroe be temporarily relieved of her duties as HOA president pending a full internal review." The motion received immediate support from two other board members who had previously rubber-stamped Karen's every decision. The vote was 4-1, with Karen herself casting the only dissenting vote. She was stripped of her position effective immediately. Her key to the HOA office ceremoniously handed over to the vice president. "This is a temporary setback," Karen insisted as she surrendered her credentials. "Once legal counsel reviews the situation, my authority will be restored." But her voice lacked its usual conviction. The iron certainty that had been her trademark was replaced by a brittle defensiveness that fooled no one. Within days, resignations began. Board member Elizabeth Palmer stepped down, citing personal reasons that everyone understood to mean self-preservation. The Architectural Review Committee dissolved entirely when 3 of its 5 members resigned simultaneously after county investigators began examining denied applications that appeared to show patterns of discrimination. The HOA itself faced an existential crisis. The county zoning board, expanding on my father's initial discovery, commissioned a comprehensive review of Oak Ridge Estates' legal standing. The results were devastating. Not only was our street improperly incorporated, but several other areas had similar documentation problems. Nearly 40% of the homes Karen had ruled over were legally beyond her authority. For those properties that remained legitimately within HOA jurisdiction, the county imposed strict oversight. All financial decisions required county approval. Architectural guidelines were suspended pending review. Fines collected under questionable circumstances were held in escrow until proper adjudication could be completed. Karen, desperate to salvage something from the collapse of her kingdom, attempted a last stand. She hired an attorney from the city and filed suit against both the county and my father personally, alleging malicious interference with legitimate community governance and deliberate misrepresentation of regulatory status. The lawsuit never made it past the preliminary hearing. Judge Alina Walsh, known for her impatience with frivolous litigation, dismissed the case with prejudice. The plaintiff has failed to establish standing to bring this action, she declared, given that the regulatory authority claimed as the basis for injury has been demonstrably invalid from inception. She fixed Karen with a stern gaze over her reading glasses. This court will not entertain attempts to enforce rights that never legally existed. The community's perception shifted with remarkable speed. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid us now stopped to chat. Some offered apologies for their silence during our ordeal. Others shared their own stories of intimidation under Karen's reign. What had been isolation transformed into something unexpected. Respect. My father, who had navigated the complex county regulatory system with such precision, became something of a local legend. "Your dad really showed them," Tommy's friend Jake commented one afternoon as they shot baskets in our driveway, the same basketball hoop that had once earned us a $300 fine. "My mom says he is the only person who ever stood up to Mrs. Monroe and won." Perhaps the most satisfying vindication came silently. One morning, walking to school, I passed Karen's house and noticed something different. The "For Sale" sign had appeared overnight, its presence both jarring and deeply satisfying. Her meticulously maintained lawn, about which she had lectured so many others, already showed signs of neglect. The flagship property of Oak Ridge Estates, the standard against which all others had been measured, was being abandoned. 3 weeks later, a moving truck arrived. I watched from across the street as Karen supervised the loading of her possessions, her movements stiff and her expression closed. Her husband worked silently alongside the movers, avoiding eye contact with passing neighbors. Not once did Karen glance in the direction of our house, though she must have felt our presence, must have known that we were witnessing her departure. By evening, the truck was gone. The house stood empty, its windows dark. The flagpole from which she had once flown the HOA flag, a symbol of her authority, stood bare against the twilight sky. It was strange how something so small could signify something so complete, the end of a regime that had terrorized families like ours for years. That night at dinner, no one mentioned Karen's departure directly, but my father raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To home," he said simply, and we all understood what he really meant. To victory, to justice, to standing your ground when it would have been easier to retreat. Spring arrived at Oak Ridge Estates with a different energy than the previous year. The community that had once operated under Karen's iron rule was finding a new identity, one built on actual community rather than enforced conformity. The HOA still existed, but in a dramatically restructured form, its powers limited, and its leadership rotated among volunteer homeowners who viewed their role as facilitators rather than enforcers. Our street, along with several others affected by the jurisdictional issue, formed a separate neighborhood association. It was voluntary, focused on community events and genuine improvement projects rather than punitive rule enforcement. My father, despite numerous requests, declined any official position, but agreed to serve as a consultant to help draft bylaws that would prevent the abuses of the past. "The goal is not to eliminate standards," he explained at the first meeting, held in our backyard with neighbors seated in lawn chairs. The goal is to ensure those standards serve the community rather than control it. The changes extended beyond organizational charts. There was a palpable shift in how neighbors interacted. The Thompsons' treehouse, once deemed an aesthetic violation, became a gathering spot for neighborhood children, including my brother Tommy. The Garcias installed their solar panels, which turned out to be not an eyesore but a point of pride as other families followed suit, turning Oak Ridge Estates into one of the most energy-efficient neighborhoods in the county. Even the community pool, once the site of Karen's most arbitrary rule enforcement, transformed into a genuinely welcoming space. The list of regulations, once covering an entire wall, was replaced by a simple sign: be respectful, be safe, be neighbors. For our family, the change was profound. No more envelopes appeared on our door. No more fines accumulated. No more anxious conversations about whether we belonged. Instead, there were invitations to barbecues, to community planning sessions, to the simple, everyday interactions that form the true fabric of neighborhood life. My mother, perhaps the most deeply wounded by Karen's campaign, bloomed like her garden in this new atmosphere. She unpacked her gnomes, positioning them among her flowers with deliberate care. When neighbors commented on them, it was with genuine appreciation for their whimsy rather than judgment of their taste. My father watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. He never gloated about his victory, never spoke ill of Corinne even after her departure. When asked about the whole ordeal, he would simply say, "Communities work best when everyone has a voice and no one has a gavel." The ultimate testament to the transformation came when the new community board, seeking to heal old wounds, invited my father to consult on revised guidelines for the reconstituted HOA. He accepted without hesitation, bringing decades of regulatory experience to the task of creating a framework that would preserve the best aspects of community standards while preventing the abuses of power that had characterized the previous regime. "Your dad is kind of a legend now," my friend Sophia remarked one afternoon as we walked home from school. "My parents say he saved the neighborhood from itself." I looked at our house as we approached, the blue porch that had started it all, the basketball hoop that had once been declared a violation, the garden gnomes peering from between carefully tended flowers. It was the same house that had been the center of so much conflict, yet now it stood as something else entirely, a symbol of standing firm against injustice, of fighting back within the rules rather than breaking them. That evening I found my father on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunset over the neighborhood he had transformed. "Do you ever regret buying this house?" I asked, settling into the chair beside him. "After everything that happened?" He considered the question carefully in that measured way he had. "No," he finally said. "This house taught all of us something important. Your mother learned how strong she truly is. You and Tommy learned that systems can be changed from within if you understand how they work. And he paused, smiling slightly. "I was reminded that the most important battles are not won with force but with knowledge and patience." As twilight deepened over Oak Ridge Estates, children played freely on lawns that had once been subject to inspection. Neighbors chatted across property lines that had previously served as boundaries of suspicion. And in our garden, illuminated by solar lights that would never be subject to HOA regulation, my mother's gnome stood proud and colorful. It was more than just a house now. It was a testimony to resilience, to standing firm when it would have been easier to flee. "You know what the best part is," my father said, interrupting my thoughts. "It is not that we won. It is that everyone else did too." He gestured toward the neighborhood spread before us, where families moved freely without the shadow of arbitrary authority. "That is the difference between power and leadership. Power controls, leadership liberates. I thought about Corinne Monroe, who had wielded her position like a weapon until it crumbled in her hands. And I thought about my father, who had fought not just for our family, but for an entire community that had forgotten what it meant to truly be neighbors. As night fell completely over Oak Ridge Estates, lights came on in windows across the neighborhood. Not uniform, not prescribed, but varied and individual, just like the families who lived behind them. And in that moment, I understood what true victory looked like. Not the defeat of an enemy, but the creation of something better in the space they once controlled. My father had not just banned the HOA from our county. He had replaced fear with freedom, suspicion with trust, control with community. And that, I realized, was a far more lasting revenge than Corinne Monroe would ever understand.